In the spring of 1378, the College of Cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church gathered in Rome and elected a new pope. By autumn of the same year, a different group of cardinals, many of the same men who had participated in the spring election, gathered in Anagni, declared that the spring election had been invalid and elected a different pope. Both men claimed to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter. Both commanded genuine institutional obedience from significant portions of the Church's hierarchy and from different European monarchies. Both excommunicated the other. From the perspective of a medieval Catholic, for whom excommunication meant damnation, and for whom the Church's authority to bind and loose souls was the central fact of spiritual life, the situation was not merely administratively inconvenient. It was existentially terrifying. For the next 39 years, the Catholic Church would have two, and for a period 3, simultaneously reigning popes. The Western Schism, distinct from the Great Schism of 1054 that had divided Latin and Eastern Christianity, shook the institutional foundations of the medieval papacy more severely than any crisis since the early Church. It did not ultimately destroy the institution, but it permanently weakened a dimension of papal authority that had taken centuries to construct and could never be fully rebuilt. The immediate cause of the schism was a disputed election conducted under conditions of physical intimidation, but the structural causes ran considerably deeper. The papacy had been resident at Avignon in southern France since 1309, under a succession of French popes who maintained the papal court under conditions of considerable French royal influence. This Avignon papacy, described by Italian contemporaries as the Babylonian captivity of the Church, a reference to the Israelites' exile in Babylon, was widely criticized as overly subject to French political interests and insufficiently independent of secular power. Catherine of Siena, among others, wrote directly to Pope Gregory XI urging his return to Rome, which occurred in 1377. Gregory XI died in Rome in March of 1378. The cardinals who gathered for the conclave were themselves largely French, reflecting the Avignon period's composition of the College of Cardinals. The Roman populace, determined that the new pope should be Italian and should remain in Rome rather than returning to Avignon, surrounded the conclave with threatening crowds and demanded an Italian pope. The cardinals, in an atmosphere of intimidation they subsequently described in detail, elected an Italian archbishop of Bari, who took the name Urban VI. Urban VI's behavior following his election provided the cardinals with their pretext for reversal. He proved erratic, abusive, and temperamentally unsuited to the office by any diplomatic standard, insulting cardinals to their faces, threatening reforms that would have dramatically reduced their financial privileges, and conducting himself in ways that alarmed his electors within weeks of the election. The cardinals retreated from Rome, declaring that the election had been invalid due to the intimidation they had experienced, and elected a French cardinal who took the name Clement VII and returned to Avignon. Both elections had genuine canonical complications. The intimidation at Urban's election was real. The cardinal's subsequent conduct in electing him without protest and the letters of congratulation they sent him in the weeks following made the claim of duress legally questionable. The reversal was, to a significant degree, motivated by the cardinal's distaste for Urban's behavior rather than by sincere constitutional concern, but the constitutional argument was available and was made. Europe divided along lines that were as much political as theological. France, Scotland, Castile, Aragon, Naples, and several other kingdoms recognized the Avignon line, Clement VII and his successor, Benedict XIII. England, the Holy Roman Empire, Hungary, Poland, Scandinavia, and Portugal recognized the Roman line. Urban VI and his successors Boniface IX, Innocent VII, and Gregory XII. The division tracked existing political alignments with considerable precision. France's enemies tended to recognize Rome. France's allies tended to recognize Avignon. The practical consequences for ordinary Christians were the existential dilemma that the theologians of the period struggled to address. If Urban was the true pope, then Clement was an antipope, and everyone who followed him was in schism and potentially damned. If Clement was the true pope, the reverse applied. And since the cardinals had participated in both elections, and since the institutional machinery for determining legitimacy was itself divided, there was no canonical mechanism that could resolve the question. The great minds of the period applied themselves to the problem. Catherine of Siena, who died in 1380, having spent her final years in agonized support of Urban's Roman line, left letters that document the spiritual torment the schism produced in devout believers. The theologian Jean Gerson at the University of Paris became the leading intellectual voice for what came to be known as conciliarism, the doctrine that a general council of the Church held authority superior to any individual pope, and that a council could therefore resolve a situation in which the papal succession itself was disputed. Conciliarism was a revolutionary idea in the context of the medieval Church's developed theology of papal supremacy. The Gregorian reform of the 11th century and the pontificate of Innocent III in the early 13th had built a conception of papal authority as the apex of the entire Christian social order. The Pope as the vicar of Christ on earth, from whose authority all other authority derived. Conciliarism implied that this supreme authority was itself subordinate to the collective authority of the Church as expressed through a council. The schism had made this implication not merely theoretically attractive, but practically necessary. The resolution of the schism came through exactly the conciliar mechanism that Gerson and others had advocated, but not before a period during which the crisis deepened further. The Council of Pisa in 1409, convened by cardinals from both obediences who had despaired of resolving the dispute through conventional means, deposed both existing popes and elected a third, Alexander V, who died the following year and was succeeded by John XXII. The existing popes refused to accept their deposition. The result was 3 simultaneous claimants to the papacy rather than 2. The Council of Constance, meeting from 1414 to 1418, finally resolved the situation. It secured the resignation of the Roman line's Gregory XII, deposed John XXII for various offenses including simony and immoral conduct, and eventually secured the removal of the Avignon line's Benedict XIII through the withdrawal of his remaining political support. A new conclave elected Martin V in 1417. Martin's election was accepted across virtually the entire Latin Church, ending the schism after 39 years. The Council of Constance also issued decrees asserting conciliar authority over popes, stating explicitly that a general council was superior to the pope in matters of faith and church governance. These decrees were issued before Martin V's election, and the extent to which they bound him was immediately contested. Martin himself and subsequent popes worked systematically to undermine the conciliarist interpretation, reasserting papal supremacy in the following decades. The Western Schism's most important long-term consequence was not the damage it did to any particular pope's authority, but the damage it did to the concept of unitary, unquestionable papal authority as such. For a generation, educated Europeans had lived with the reality that the supposed vicar of Christ was one of 2 or 3 competing claimants, each excommunicating the others, and that their own salvation might depend on following the right one. The experience made it impossible to sustain the same kind of unreflective deference to papal authority that had characterized the high medieval period. The question, how can we know the Pope's claim is valid, once asked seriously, was not easily unasked. The conciliarist movement that the schism generated, the intellectual tradition arguing that councils were superior to popes, remained a significant force in Catholic thought through the 15th century and created the institutional and theological context in which, a century later, the Protestant Reformation would find receptive audiences. When Martin Luther challenged papal authority in 1517, he was operating in an intellectual environment that the Western Schism had significantly prepared. The argument that the papacy was not the infallible and unreformable summit of Christian authority had been made seriously and in good faith by devout Catholics for a generation, and the schism had given an empirical force that purely theoretical argument could not achieve. The papal court eventually returned to Rome and rebuilt its institutional authority, culminating in the Counter-Reformation papacy's reassertion of supremacy at the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century. But the papal authority that emerged from Trent was different in kind from what had existed before 1378. More defensive, more explicit, more carefully articulated, precisely because it had been challenged in ways that required explicit defense. The challenge had left a mark that explicit formulation could not entirely erase.